Dad, that man is changing our locks.
What are you doing with my things?
The shop isn't ours anymore.
Read me the line under that, slow and exact, while I keep my eyes on him.
It says the agent who signed the whole place over for you was Uncle Desmond. His name is right where yours should be.
I've got a work order in my hand, sir. Take your pictures if you want, but this lock is coming out today.
That lock was my father's, and his own hands set the frame it sits in.
He walked her a few steps down the block, out of the man's hearing, and crouched to her eye level.
When your uncle came by, 2 Sundays ago, what exactly did he tell you that afternoon?
That everything was handled and the taxes were all paid. He said it in the back room, by the press, with his hand on your shoulder.
Amos remembered the hand on his shoulder. He remembered being grateful for it. He was 44 years old. He had run Dupree and Son Print on the corner of Beulah and Ives for 16 years, and his father Otis had run it 30 years before that, back when the sign out front was hand-set 1 wooden letter at a time. He fixed the world's paper for a living. Wedding programs, funeral cards, ballots for the church elections. He made other people's documents come out straight and clean and true, and he had never once imagined that a piece of paper could be aimed at a man like a rifle. The man who raised him had taught him that you do not rush at a thing that has already happened, and so he did not rush now. Here is what a stranger would need to know to understand the size of what was taken on that sidewalk. Amos Dupre's wife, Vivian, had done the books for the shop for 11 years. She kept the ledgers in her own looping hand, and she wrote the customers' names on a chalkboard behind the counter, in a script so clean that people used to ask if it was printed. She got sick in the fall of 1 year, and she was gone by the spring, and the medical bills came in a stack taller than their daughter, and Amos, who could read a proof sheet upside down at 10 feet, but had never learned the language of tax notices and escrow and delinquency, watched the paperwork of his life pile up in a corner and turn into a country he did not speak. His younger brother stepped in. Desmond was 39, and he had spent his adult life just outside of things that were about to work. He had sold real estate for a while. He had done appraisals. He had a way of talking that made you feel that the boring parts of life were being carried by competent hands. And after Vivian's funeral, when Desmond offered to take over the shop's paperwork, something in Amos's chest that had been clenched for 6 months let go. Family, he thought. His father used to say that blood was the one seam you never had to test. You could trust it to hold under any load. Desmond told him the shop had fallen 2 years behind on property taxes. He said the county would eventually sell what they called a tax lien if the debt was not cleared, and that strangers bought those liens the way buzzards work a fence line, and that the only safe move was to pay the whole thing off at once and keep the county's hands off the family's name. He said the number was $40,000. Amos did not have $40,000. What he had was the small life insurance policy Vivian had carried through her job, the one clean thing that had come out of the worst year of his life. And he cashed it, and on a Tuesday morning, he walked into the Third Foundry Bank on Delmar Street and bought a cashier's check for $40,000, made payable to the Crescent County Tax Commissioner, and he handed it to his brother in the parking lot and asked him to please take care of it. That was 16 months before the locksmith knelt at his door. A few weeks after he handed over the check, Desmond had brought him something else. A single sheet on county letterhead, stamped paid in full, the parcel number typed clean across the top, and the balance zeroed out. Amos had taped it to the wall beside the register and looked at it for a week the way you look at a wound that has finally closed. Then Zora had filed it in the tin box, because Zora filed everything. Neither of them had ever held it up to the light. He had not thought about it again. That was the shameful part. The part he would have to say out loud in a courtroom before this was over. He had handed the most important piece of paper of his life to the one person he believed he would never have to watch. And then he had gone back to setting other people's type, and he had slept. Zora had not slept the same way. Zora had been 11 when her mother died, and something in her had decided quietly and without telling anyone that she would become the person who kept track now. She took over the chalkboard. She learned the ledger. She made a filing system in a red tin toolbox that had once held her grandfather's type gauges, and into that box went every receipt that passed through the shop, each one dated in the corner in her small, deliberate hand. Her father thought it was a child playing office. He let her, because it made her feel close to her mother, and because it cost nothing, and because a man raising a girl alone learns to say yes to the harmless things. He did not know yet that the harmless thing was going to be the only wall left standing. That night, after their locksmith had gone and a second notice had been zip-tied to the door handle, Amos sat at the kitchen table in the back rooms where he and Zora lived, and he laid the papers under the lamp. He did not trust paper over people, but he trusted how things were made. A man who sets type for a living knows that every printed thing carries the fingerprints of the hand that built it. He read the deed the way he read a bad proof, running his thumb down the margin, feeling for the place where the plate had slipped. The shop and the land under it transferred out of his name and into Larkspur Holdings, through a chain that began with a tax sale he had never been told about. And there, listed as the family agent who had facilitated the transfer, his brother's name, in a font his brother had chosen. "You never signed it," Zora said from the doorway. She was in her pajamas, and she had the tin box under her arm. "No." "Then how did it happen without your name?" He did not have an answer for her, and he would not lie to her. So he said the true thing. "I don't know yet, but it happened on paper, and paper is the one thing in this world I know how to read." She came and sat across from him. She opened the tin box and she began to walk backward through it, month by month, the way he had taught her to walk a job backward when a print run came out wrong. She was looking for a specific rectangle of paper. She found it near the bottom, 16 months down, and she slid it across the table under the lamp without a word. It was the bank's receipt for the cashier's check, $40,000, payable to the Crescent County Tax Commissioner. A serial number, 6208831, a date, and in the corner, in an 11-year-old's careful print, because she had filed it herself the afternoon he brought it home, the words for the shop taxes, so we keep it. Amos looked at that receipt for a long time. "Dad," Zora said, "if you paid the taxes, why did they sell it?" He heard the question, and he felt the floor of the thing shift under him, because it was the right question, the one that turned a tragedy into a crime. He had paid the taxes. He had the receipt. The county had sold the shop for unpaid taxes anyway. Both of those things could not be true at the same time unless someone had stood in the exact space between the money and the county and taken the money and let the shop fall. Only one person had ever stood in that space. He did not sleep that night, and in the morning, he did the first thing his father had taught him to do when a job went wrong, which was to go back to the beginning and check the source. He drove downtown to the Crescent County Tax Office when the doors opened, and he stood at the counter with his receipt in a plastic sleeve, and he asked a simple question. He asked whether a cashier's check, serial number 6208831, for $40,000 had ever been received and applied to the taxes on the property at Beulah and Ives. The woman at the counter was named Arlene Cobb. She was near 60, with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan the color of old paper. And she had worked that counter for 22 years while 3 tax commissioners came and went and took the credit for what she actually knew. People treated her like part of the furniture. People told her things in front of her the way you talk in front of a lamp. She took Amos's receipt, and she typed, and she frowned, and she typed again, and then she went very still in a way that a man learns to notice. "Mr. Dupree," she said quietly, "there is no record of this check ever being received by this office. It was made out to your office. I understand that. I'm telling you, it never reached this ledger. The taxes on that parcel were never paid. They went to the tax sale 15 months ago." She lowered her voice, though there was no one near. "They were bought by an entity called Larkspur Holdings." "For how much?" She looked at the screen. The opening bid was the back taxes owed, which came to a little over $39,000. Amos stood very still. His check had been for $40,000. The buyer had paid a little over $39,000. He was not a man who was good with numbers on a page, but he could feel the shape of that one, the way you feel a wall in the dark. His own money, cashed out of his dead wife's policy, had not paid his taxes. It had bought his shop out from under him, at auction, for a stranger's company, and the difference between what he gave and what the stranger paid was small enough to fit in a man's pocket. "Ma'am," he said, "how does a person even find out about a tax sale in time to buy it?" Arlene Cobb took off her reading glasses. "That," she said, "is a very good question. Most people never find out at all. That's the whole design of it." She looked at him for a moment. This quiet man in a print shop apron he had forgotten to take off, holding a receipt like it was the last warm thing in the world, and something in her 22 years of standing at that counter watching this exact thing happen to people who looked like him decided to move. Come back this afternoon. Ask for me by name. Don't talk to anyone else. I want to pull the file before I say another word. He went back that afternoon. She had the file, and the file was where the accident stopped looking like an accident. Because a tax sale in Crescent County did not simply happen to a person. The law required that the county mail notices, several of them, over many months to the owner of record, warning that the taxes were unpaid, that a sale was coming, that a sale had occurred, and that a clock was now running on the owner's right to buy the property back. 12 months the law gave you. 12 months to redeem. Amos had received none of it. Not one envelope. He would have remembered a letter that said he was about to lose his father's shop. A man remembers the letters that could end him. Arlene laid the file open on the counter and turned it so he could read it, and she put her finger on a single form near the front. 11 months ago, she said, someone filed a change of mailing address on this parcel. Every notice this office generated for the owner of record was redirected. It stopped going to Beulah and Ives. It started going to a post office box across town. Who filed it? It's signed, she said, right there. Amos looked. He knew the signature. He had watched that hand learn to write at their mother's kitchen table 30-odd years before. It was his brother's name, in his brother's hand, on a county form that had quietly turned off every warning bell the law had built to protect him, so that a 12-month clock could run all the way down in a silence that had been engineered on purpose. That was the moment Amos Dupree understood that his brother had not made a mistake, or gotten in over his head, or panicked. A man who panics does not file a change of address form 11 months in advance. A change of address form is not something that happens to you. It is something you sit down and do, with a pen, thinking about the future. He did not go to Desmond. Not yet. His father had a rule about a job that had gone wrong, and the rule was that you do not confront the machine until you understand the whole machine. Because a machine you only half understand will take the rest of your hand. So instead, he asked Arlene Cobb one more question. The question that turned his own private ruin into something with a shape much larger than himself. Ma'am, Larkspur Holdings, the company that bought my shop. Has that name come across your counter before? Arlene Cobb was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Dupree, I have been standing at this counter for 22 years, and in the last 3 years, that name, and 2 others just like it, have bought more homes in Crescent Hill than I can count on both hands. Old people, widows, families that just buried somebody and got behind, always right after a funeral, always for the back taxes and not $1 more. She took a breath. I have watched this happen from this side of the counter for 3 years, and I have wanted to say something to somebody for 3 years, and everyone I could say it to signs the same paychecks as the people buying the houses. If you have ever handed something you love to a person because they shared your blood, and told yourself that was the one arrangement in the world that did not need watching, stay with this story to the end, because the only reason it does not stop here in the dark is a receipt that a grieving 11-year-old filed in a tin box and never mentioned to anyone. Amos went home and he sat with what he now knew, which was too big to hold in his 2 hands. His brother had not stolen a shop. His brother was one small gear in something that had been quietly hollowing out the whole neighborhood, house by house, funeral by funeral, and the reason no one had ever caught it was that it ran on paper. And paper in this county was believed the way people used to believe the church bell, without ever asking who had climbed the tower to ring it. He needed someone who spoke the language he did not speak. He could not afford a lawyer, and he knew what the private firms downtown thought of a print shop owner from Crescent Hill with a grievance about his own brother. So he went to the county legal aid office in a strip mall out past the interstate, and he waited 2 hours on a plastic chair, and he was finally shown to the desk of a young attorney named Nora Beckett, who could not have been 30, who had a stack of files on her desk taller than the one that had buried him after Vivian died, and who looked, frankly, like someone the courthouse had already decided not to take seriously. He almost walked out. He was glad, later, that he did not, because underestimating Nora Beckett turned out to be the second most expensive mistake anyone made in this entire story. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which no one had done. Then she asked to see the receipt, and the deed, and the change of address form he had photographed at the county office. She laid them out on her desk in a row, and she looked at them the way Amos looked at a proof. And after a while she said a sentence that Amos would remember for the rest of his life. "They didn't steal your shop, Mr. Dupree. That's the mistake everybody's going to want to make, including you. They didn't steal it. They built a set of true-looking documents around it until it looked like you gave it away. Those are different crimes. And the second one leaves fingerprints, because somebody has to sit down and make each piece of paper. So what do? We do the thing they were counting on nobody in this neighborhood being able to do," Nora said. "We read all of it, every page, in order, and we find the one page where a person got greedy and stopped being careful. Because the paperwork is only as strong as its most careful sheet, and nobody stays careful all the way to the end." They worked for 2 weeks. Amos brought her the shop's old records, the ones Vivian had kept and Zora had preserved, and it turned out that a family that keeps its receipts is a family that is very hard to erase. Nora subpoenaed the bank, and the bank produced the record of what had happened to cashier's check number 6208831. It had not been cashed by the county, because the county had never touched it. It had been returned to the purchaser's brother as the presenting party 11 days after it was issued, deposited into an account controlled by Larkspur Holdings, and used within the same week to place the winning bid at the tax sale on the very property it had been drawn to protect. The money had traveled in a perfect small circle. Vivian's insurance had paid to take her husband's shop. Nora pulled the incorporation papers for Larkspur Holdings, and behind the registered agent smokescreen, the sole member and manager of the company was Desmond A. Dupree. There was no partner. There was no boss above him in this. The thing Amos had assumed, that his brother must be a pawn of some larger man, the way you assume the person who hurt you must have been forced to, turned out to be a comfort he was not allowed to keep. His brother was not the pawn. In his own small territory, his brother was the whole hand. There was one more thing in the old ledgers, and Amos found it himself, late on the second night, and he did not tell Nora until morning, because he needed to sit with it alone first. 4 years back, in the months before Vivian got sick, in her own looping hand was a small column she had kept apart from all the others. Money going out, money coming back. She had labeled it with a single letter. D. 200 here, 400 there. Always returned inside the same month, always in her writing, never in his. His wife had caught his brother's hand in the drawer years before the sickness, or the funeral, and she had quietly covered it, out of her own end of the books, and she had never once said a word to Amos. She had known what it would do to a man to be told that the one seam he never tested had already failed a quiet test. So she had carried it alone and let him keep his brother whole in his mind. It had cost her almost nothing then. It was costing him everything now. But he was not the only one playing the game. Nora cross-referenced the 2 other shell companies Arlene Cobb had named, and the pattern came up out of the water all at once, dripping and undeniable. Over 3 years, 3 shell companies had bought 31 properties in Crescent Hill. Every one of them a home or a family business. Every one of them taken at a tax sale for the bare amount of back taxes. Every one of them belonging to someone old or grieving or both. And when Nora mapped the 31 properties onto a city plan, they did not scatter. They clustered. They ran in a nearly solid line down both sides of Beulah Street and around the corner onto Ives, forming the shape of something. The shape of an assembly. The shape of a single large parcel being quietly stitched together out of 31 small heartbreaks, so that one day it could be sold whole for a number with a great many more zeros than any single widow had ever been robbed of. "Somebody is buying the whole neighborhood one dead spouse at a time," Nora said, and for the first time her young voice was not steady. "And your brother is holding the corner, the most valuable piece, because the corner of Beulah and Ives is the piece the whole assembly falls apart without." That was the twist that told Amos his brother's real size. Desmond had not stumbled into hurting his family. Desmond had understood that the shop was the keystone, that its corner lot was the one parcel a developer could not build the block without, and he had gone after his own brother first, precisely because he was the easiest door in the wall and the most important one. The betrayal had not been careless. It had been strategic. Amos had been chosen. They found the developer 3 days later, A company called Ridgeline Development had, over the same 3 years, filed a series of preliminary site plans with the city for a mixed-use tower on the block, bounded by Beulah and Ives. And attached to Ridgeline's most recent zoning application, as proof that the developer had control of the land, was a schedule of purchase agreements. 31 of them. Every shell company's holdings lined up to be sold to Ridgeline in a single closing. For a total, the schedule listed in figures that made Zora, reading over her father's shoulder, go quiet. And there, on the schedule, was the corner. Beulah and Ives, Larkspur Holdings as seller. A purchase agreement between Desmond's company and Ridgeline Development, signed and dated. Nora saw the date before Amos did. She put her finger on it, and she did not say anything for a moment because she wanted to be sure she was right. And then she said it slowly. "Mr. Dupree, look at when your brother signed this." He looked. "Your brother agreed to sell your shop to this developer 8 months ago," Nora said. "The tax sale gave him a deed, but under the law, that deed wasn't finally his yet, because your 12 months to buy it back hadn't run out. Your right to redeem was alive until 3 months ago." She tapped the date again. "He signed a contract to sell a shop that would not legally be his for another 5 months. He sold it while your clock was still running, which means 8 months ago, he already knew your clock was never going to be allowed to help you. He knew because he was the one who had turned it off. There is a difference between a man who takes a thing because it fell into his hands and a man who sells a thing before it is his, because he has already arranged for its owner to fail. The first is a thief. The second is premeditation. The law does not often get to prove. Desmond had done the one thing his caution could not survive. He had gotten greedy about the timeline. He had wanted the sale locked in and the money promised, and he had not been able to make himself wait the 5 months for his own paperwork to ripen. "That page proves he meant to do it," Nora said. "Everything else he built is airtight. That one shows his hand." Now they had the machine mapped. Now Amos understood the whole of it. And now, at last, his father's rule allowed him to go and stand in front of the man. He did not do it alone, and he did not do it in secret, because Nora had taught him that a confrontation in private is just a story that two people tell differently later. He did it in the daylight, in a place that would matter. The Crescent County Board of Commissioners held a public hearing on a Tuesday evening to approve a zoning variance for a new mixed-use development on the Beulah and Ives block, submitted by Ridgeline Development. It was the last approval the Assembly needed. Once the variance passed, the 31 heartbreaks would close into one clean sale, and the paper would harden into the kind of fact that no court ever reopens. The whole scheme had a single remaining night in which it could still be stopped, and it was that night. Desmond would be there. Amos knew he would, because Desmond had spent his life needing to be in the room where the important thing happened, standing near it, feeling like the competent hands. And Amos knew something else, which was the piece he and Nora had built their whole plan around. Desmond did not know they had found the change of address form. He did not know they had traced the check. He did not know they had the dated contract. He believed his brother was exactly what the whole county believed his brother was, a quiet man in a printer's apron who was slow with paper and would never in his life read his way to the bottom of a thing this deep. Desmond's entire safety rested on the underestimation of Amos Dupree. It was the same underestimation the tax office had counted on, and the developer had counted on, and the whole machine had counted on. Everyone in this story had made the same bet, and the bet was that the man they had chosen could not read. The plan was simple, which is the only kind of plan that survives a room. Nora would file, that afternoon, an emergency petition in Superior Court to set aside the tax deed on Beulah and Ives for fraud and to void the whole assembly of purchase agreements as the fruit of a coordinated scheme. That petition, once filed, was a public record, and Amos would stand up during the public comment period at the commissioner's hearing, in front of the developer, in front of the board, in front of the reporter from the county paper who always sat in the third row. And he would not make accusations, because accusations are easy to wave off. He would do the one thing that a man who sets type for a living knows how to do better than anyone. He would read the documents out loud, in order, and he would let the room watch a story assemble itself the way a page assembles itself, one true line at a time, until it could not be unread. The danger was real, and Nora made him sit with it before he agreed. Desmond was not a cartoon. He was a desperate man who had bet everything, a man buried under debts that Nora's subpoenas had begun to surface, a man whose whole future now depended on a closing that Amos was about to try to blow up in a public room. A man like that, cornered, does not sit quietly, and the board itself was not friendly ground. The chairman of the commission had taken campaign money from people connected to Ridgeline, and the easiest thing in the world for that board to do was to rule Amos out of order, to call his 3 minutes expired, to have a quiet man escorted from a public building for making a scene, and to let the story that got told afterward be the story of an angry man who could not accept that he had failed to pay his own taxes. That was the knife Desmond would reach for, and Amos knew it, because Desmond had already reached for it once. 2 nights before the hearing, Desmond had come to the back door of the rooms where Amos and Zora lived, uninvited, holding a paper bag of the donuts he always brought, as if the shop were still theirs and this were still a family. He had sat at the kitchen table where their mother had taught them both to write, and he had made his offer in the reasonable voice he used for everything. "I know how this looks," Desmond had said, "but you were going to lose it anyway, Amos. You were behind. You were drowning. I stepped in, and I made sure it stayed in the family instead of going to some stranger from out of state. You can rent it back. I'll give you a fair rate. You keep your press, you keep your customers, and you don't have to carry the paperwork anymore, which we both know you were never built for." "You turned my mail off," Amos had said. For just a second, something had moved behind Desmond's face, and then the reasonable voice had smoothed back over it. "I don't know what you think you found, but I'd be careful, big brother. You've got a little girl in this house. A man in your position, no money, no shop, going around town making wild accusations against his own family, telling people the county's out to get him. That's not a stable picture. People notice a picture like that. A judge notices. You want to keep Zora in a stable home? You let this lie down." He had said it gently. He had said it while eating a donut. And that was the moment Amos understood that his brother would, if it came to it, reach past him and put a hand on his daughter, would use the very fact of Amos's love for her as the lever to make him be quiet, and that there was no floor beneath this man, that Amos had been counting on being there. Amos had walked his brother to the door. He had not raised his voice, because Zora was in the next room, and because a man learns. But at the door, he had said one thing. "You taught her to ride a bike in the shop parking lot. You remember that?" Desmond had not answered. "She kept the receipt," Amos had said. "That's all. Good night." He had shut the door, and he had not slept. And he had known then that there was no arrangement, no rented shop, no fair rate, that he could accept, because a man who would use your child as leverage has already told you the whole truth about himself. And the only thing left to decide is whether you will be brave in the daylight or quiet in the dark. He chose the daylight. The night before the hearing, he went through the tin box one more time, not hunting for anything, just needing to hold the paper his daughter had saved. He picked up the county letter, the paid-in-full one, to file it back, and his thumb stopped on its edge the way it stopped on a bad weld. The weight was wrong. County paper is thin gray sulfite stock, 1/4 cent a sheet. This sheet had tooth. It had rag in it. He carried it to the lamp and tilted it, and a watermark rose up out of the fiber. 2 letters laid into the mold, and the floor of the whole thing shifted under him one last time. He did not call Nora. Some pages a man needs to turn over himself, in his own hand, in his own light. The hearing room was full. Word had spread, the way word spreads in a neighborhood that has been quietly bleeding for 3 years without being able to name the wound. And the old people of Crescent Hill had come, the widows and the widowers. Miss Odessa Flowers, who had lost the house her husband built with his hands, Mr. Earl Sutton, who had buried his wife and then, 4 months later, been buried himself under a tax sale he never saw coming. They filled the folding chairs. Arlene Cobb sat among them in her paper-colored cardigan, off the clock, having decided after 22 years that there were some things worth more than a pension you were only 2 years from anyway. Desmond sat near the front, on the side, in a good coat, close to the men from Ridgeline, feeling like the competent hands. The board worked through its agenda. The Ridgeline variance came up. A lawyer for the developer spoke smoothly for 10 minutes about revitalization and tax base and jobs, and slides glowed on the wall showing a glass tower where the print shop was, and the board members nodded the way men nod at a thing that has already been decided. Then the chairman, with the small impatience of a man doing a formality, opened the floor for public comment, and he said that each speaker would have 3 minutes, and Amos Dupree stood up. He walked to the small podium with a manila folder. He did not look at his brother. He gave his name and his address. The corner of Beulah and Ives, and a few people in the room drew breath, because they knew that corner. That was the print shop. That was Otis Dupree's shop, and some of them had been coming there for 50 years. "I'm not going to make an accusation tonight," Amos said, and his voice was the calm, level voice of a man reading a proof. "I set type for a living, so instead of telling you what to think, I'm going to read you some documents, in the order they were made, and I'm going to trust this room to be able to read." The chairman said something about staying on the topic of the variance. Amos said, evenly, that every word would be about the variance, because the variance was built on top of these exact pages, and he asked for his 3 minutes, and there were enough people in that room now leaning forward that the chairman, calculating, let him go. Amos read the receipt first. $40,000, payable to the Crescent County Tax Commissioner, the serial number, the date. Then he read the county's own record, which he had gotten certified, showing that the check was never received and the taxes never paid. He let those 2 pages sit next to each other in the air of the room for 1 second, which is a very long time in a silent room. Then he read the change of address form. He read the address it redirected the county's warnings to, a post office box across town, and he read the name signed at the bottom, and for the first time he looked up, and he looked at his brother, and he said the name a second time, so the room could not pretend it had misheard. Desmond A. Dupree. A sound went through the room. The chairman's gavel came up, and the chairman said the speaker's time was concerned with a private family matter, and not the variance, and that his time was nearly up. And that was the moment the whole thing could have died, the moment the machine reached out to switch off the alarm one last time, the way it had switched off every alarm for 3 years by declaring the person ringing it out of order. Nora Beckett stood up from the third row. "Mr. Chairman," she said, and her young voice carried further than anyone in that room had expected, because they had all made the same bet about her too. "At 4 o'clock this afternoon, I filed an emergency action in Superior Court to void the tax deed on that corner and to set aside every purchase agreement in the Ridgeline Assembly as the product of a coordinated fraud. It is case number 25 CV 3182. It is a public record as of 2 hours ago. If this board approves this variance tonight, it approves it on top of a fraud that is already before a judge, and every one of you will have done it in a room full of witnesses and 1 reporter." She let that land. "I'd think carefully about your next motion." The room was no longer a room the chairman controlled. Amos was not finished. He had 2 pages left, and he had saved them the way you save the lines that carry the whole meaning to the end. He held up the first one. "This isn't from me," he said. "It's from the developer's own file. The schedule of what they mean to buy tonight. 31 homes and shops in this neighborhood. Every one taken at a tax sale. Every one taken from somebody who had just buried the person they loved most." He heard Miss Odessa Flowers make a small sound behind him, because her husband's house was line 19. "And here is the corner. My father's shop. Sold to this developer by Larkspur Holdings on a contract my brother signed 8 months ago, 5 months before the law had finished handing him the shop at all. You do not sell a thing that early unless you already know the true owner will never get his one chance to save it." He set the schedule down and picked up the last page, and this one was not a government form. He held it up so the room could see the county letterhead, the official stamp, the words paid in full. "My brother gave me this a year ago," he said. "A letter from the county. It told me my taxes were paid and my shop was safe. I believed it. I taped it to my wall. It is the reason I stopped worrying, right up until a stranger came to drill my father's lock out of the door." He turned and walked to the projector, into the beam of light that was still throwing the developer's glass tower up onto the wall, and he held the sheet flat against the brightness, so the whole room watched the paper light up from behind. 2 letters rose up dark out of the fiber. "That is a watermark," Amos said, and his voice did not rise. "D.S. Dupree and Son. This is my paper. I order it 1 carton at a time from a mill 4 states from here, and there is not another sheet of it in this county. No government office has ever touched paper like this in its life." He let them look. "The county did not send me this letter. My brother printed it in my shop, on my press, On the paper, my own hands unwrapped. He forged the county's promise to me, on the exact stock I used to make other people's promises real, and he put it in my hand so I would sleep while he sold my family out from under me. He did not just take the shop. He used the shop to keep me quiet while he did it. He closed the folder. Desmond was on his feet. Whatever careful, reasonable man had walked into that room was gone, and what stood in his place was a cornered one, and he said too loudly that this was a lie, that his brother was unstable, that his brother had failed to pay his own taxes and could not accept it, that everyone should consider the source. A man who could barely read a tax bill, now standing here pretending to be a lawyer. And Amos Dupre looked at his brother across a public room, and he did the only thing that could not be answered. He did not raise his voice. He set the closed folder down on the podium, and he said, "You're right that I couldn't read the paperwork, Des. That was true. That's the thing you built all of this on, that your brother couldn't read." He paused. "So I learned. It took me 2 weeks, and the first thing I read, all the way to the bottom, was you." There was nowhere in the room for Desmond to put that. He had built every safe wall he owned on a single assumption about his brother, and his brother had just quietly taken the assumption away, in front of the developer, in front of the board, in front of the neighborhood, in front of the reporter whose pen had not stopped moving. The men from Ridgeline were already gathering their coats, because men like that can feel a closing die the way a sailor feels the wind drop. The chairman, looking at the reporter, looking at the full room, looking at a case number that was now a public fact, moved to table the variance indefinitely, and the motion passed so fast it was almost comic, every commissioner suddenly eager to be on the record as the one who had wanted to wait for the facts. The cost was real, and it came due in the weeks after, because a fraud that has been read into the public record does not clean up gently. The Superior Court granted Nora's petition and set aside the tax deed on Beulah and Ives, and then, because the pattern was now impossible to unsee, the court appointed a receiver to examine all 31 properties, and the district attorney, who had been happy to ignore a neighborhood for 3 years, discovered an urgent interest in it the moment it was on the front page. Desmond was charged, not with one crime, but with a scheme of them, and the change of address forms, 31 of them in his own hand, across 3 shell companies, were the spine of the case, because a man's caution is also his signature. And Desmond had been careful the same way every single time, and that sameness was a fingerprint. He had made himself impossible to catch in any one house and impossible to miss across all of them. He did not go quietly, because men like that never do on the first swing. And for a few weeks, his lawyers filed motions and tried to carve his name out of the companies and leave the developer holding everything alone. What sank him in the end was the same appetite that had built him, not the tax deed, which was clean, not the change of address, which a good lawyer could dress up as a favor gone wrong. It was the letter. A man can argue about a deadline. A man cannot argue with his own family's watermark burning up out of a forged county seal in front of a courtroom on paper only his shop in the whole county could buy. Desmond took a plea rather than let a jury watch his brother hold that sheet up to the light a second time. He allowed nothing to be softened. And on the day of his plea, he asked to say one thing on the record, and what he said was that no one had made him file the first form, that he had done it himself, at a table with a pen, thinking he was owed it, and that he wanted it written down that his brother had paid the taxes, had done everything right, and had never once, in 44 years, deserved a single thing that Desmond had done to him. It was not an apology. It was a correction of the record. From a man who had spent 3 years falsifying records, it was the closest thing to a soul he had left. And Amos took it the way he took most things, without deciding out loud what it was worth. The shop came back. The court restored the deed to Amos, and the receiver's work began the slow, unglamorous labor of unwinding the other 30, and Miss Odessa Flowers got a letter that made her sit down on her front step and stay there a while. And Mr. Earl Sutton's children began the paperwork to recover the house their father had died, believing he had lost. Arlene Cobb testified in full, in daylight, and told the court everything she had watched from her side of the counter for 22 years. And when it was over, she said to Amos that she had slept through the night for the first time in 3 years, and that she was going to keep working that counter 2 more years after all, because she had finally figured out what the counter was for. Nora Beckett got a stack of new files and no raise, and did not seem to mind, because people like Nora never quite believed that the quiet thing they did was the whole thing, when it was. The town looked at Amos differently after that, and it was a strange coat to wear. Men who had walked past his shop for 16 years without seeing it, now stopped him on the sidewalk to shake his hand and say they had always known there was more to him. He took it the way his father had taught him to take praise from people who had not earned the right to give it, which was politely, and without correction, and without letting it become load-bearing. What mattered had not happened on a sidewalk. It had happened at a kitchen table, over a tin box, with the only person whose opinion of him had ever held any weight at all. On a Saturday that fall, Amos took Zora into the shop. The zip-tied notices were long gone from their door, but the glass still had a faint, gummy ghost where the tape had been, and he cleaned it off himself, slowly until the window was just a window again, and you could see his father's name arching across it in the gold leaf Otis had paid a man to lay down 40 years before. Inside, the press stood where it had always stood. Vivian's chalkboard was still behind the counter, and though the customer names had been wiped and rewritten 100 times since she died, Zora had never once erased the top corner, where her mother had drawn a small, looping flourish that meant nothing except that the person who made it had a steady, happy hand. He fired up the old press. He had a job to run that was not a customer's. He set the type himself, one small metal letter at a time, the way his father had taught him, and his father before that, and he would not let Zora see the words until the plate was locked. Then he inked it, and he laid a clean sheet of heavy cotton paper into the bed, and he pulled the impression, and he lifted the page and turned it around so his daughter could read it. It was a single line, and under it, a date, and under that, 2 names. She read it. She ran one finger along the pressed letters, feeling where the type had bitten into the fiber, where the ink sat down into the page and would not lift, because that is the whole nature of a thing that is printed instead of merely said. It cannot be waved off. It cannot be adjusted later to mean something else. It is set. "What does it say?" she asked, though she was looking right at it, because she wanted to hear him say it. "It says the shop belongs to us," Amos said. "It's got the date, and it's got both our names, yours over mine." He set his scarred printer's hand on the back of her neck, the way his own father used to. "That's the record. Anybody wants to know who this place belongs to, that's where they look now. Not downtown. Here. On paper we set ourselves." She looked at the page a long time. Then she carried it to the red tin box, the one that had once held her grandfather's type gauges and now held 16 months of the receipts that had saved them, and she laid the page on top, where a person would find it first. Ink dries the same on a truth and a lie. That was the whole danger of the thing, the danger that had nearly swallowed a family and a neighborhood whole. Somebody had set a lie in type and stamped it, and a whole county had read it like gospel and never once climbed the tower to ask who was ringing the bell. But a lie, once it is set next to a truth, cannot survive being read out loud, in order, in the light, by someone who was never supposed to be able to read at all. So keep your receipts, not for the money. Keep them for the day someone decides that your whole life can be rewritten with a stamp and a signature, and stack them where the quietest person in your house can reach them, because it will not be the powerful who save you, and it will not be the loud. It will be the one everybody walked past. It will be a woman behind a counter that people talked in front of like she was a lamp. It will be a girl with a tin box, filing something small and careful on an afternoon no one else remembers, keeping a receipt for a truth, so that on the worst day of your life, there is one page left in the world that still says what really happened. If someone you love handed their whole life to a person on the strength of shared blood alone, send this to them tonight, and tell them to keep the receipt.